Welcome to day 2, folks. My name is Maurits Pretorius. Wow, how exciting to have heard from Herman yesterday and to learn something more about modernization, digitization. I think specifically the often forgotten social and collaborative aspects of that. And then I think we further had the opportunity to look at how a modern digitized South Africa could look. Now today we are going to look at a different kind of modernization. But I think given yesterday's insights around the collaborative nature of payment systems, the social nature of that, probably just as important a building block, if not more, towards a modernized NPS. I, of course, refer now to the imminent changes to PASA, the SARB's announcements of a new payments industry body, or a PIB, and the very real situation that we might have something different in the place of PASA by this time next year. So just very shortly, around mid-year this year, the SARB announced their support for a new payments industry body to be established. This is intended to be a more inclusive body than what the current PASA is. Beyond some principal guidance, the SARB, however, entrusted the broader payments industry to develop the design and to recommend a model to the SARB, which they will then opine on and will decide on. But I think we're all understanding that we're fairly early in the process, and we're probably all curious about how this could pan out. Now, this illustrious panel that I have here with me today needs very little introduction. I'm sure you know the faces, and they have been invited to provide us all here today with a little bit of a deeper perspective on the matter. So can I start with my panel, introducing them? Masela is the head of the National Payments Division of the South African Reserve Bank. Ghita Erling is the current CEO of PASA. Rufaina Panubai is the head of group payments from Entersekt. Gerhard Oosthuizen, the chief technology officer of one of our fintechs, Entersekt. And Hennie Ferreira, I think, wears two hats today. He's the CEO of Microfinance South Africa, but is also the current chair of the PSSF, of the Payment Stakeholder Forum. We welcome you all and hope you can provide us with more insight on this matter. So I think let me dive straight into the questions and give you the opportunity to give us the kind of insight that I think we all are searching at this stage. And I'm going to start with you, Tim. I think what I can say is we are seeing a lot of change across the globe currently around payments industry bodies or payments associations. And almost in all instances, that has flown from a larger regulatory review. So it's not just on a whim that these associations are changing. There must, in other words, be some thought and some important drivers behind these changes. And we also in South Africa certainly saw that from the initial PASA review and the 19 recommendations in 2017, it really extended into a far wider reaching type review of the payments landscape, the payments regulatory landscape. My question, Tim, is can you remind us again, what is the regulator's main considerations and what are the main drivers behind the changes? I think firstly, broadly from the perspective of change in the payments landscape, but then also particularly related to the payments industry body and the role that you see must be played by such a body. So can you perhaps just take us through the SARB's thinking on what are those main drivers and what are those main considerations?
Thanks, Maurits, for the opportunity, and good morning to colleagues in the conference. Excited to be here. Essentially, Maurits, sketch it, I'll take it slightly higher and then bring it back indeed to where you actually placed. Essentially, where I would start is that as we recognize in the payment system, and I mean, even in this conference, the symbol, as we were opening the conference, you saw a network of parties. And in this respect, then, our starting point is that for that network to hold, we need public and private sector commitment to make that work. And flowing from there, we need to have a shared vision as the private sector and the public sector. And with the public sector here, I'm not just referring to the Reserve Bank. I'm referring to all relevant regulatory authorities, policy bodies. They need to share with the private sector on a vision that we take forward. And stemming from that, then we can plan how we develop our system going forward. Starting with South Africa, perhaps I'll remind the colleagues that we have a shared vision. We have been having several sets of shared visions, and currently we have the one that we call Vision 2025. And if you look at that vision, there's 9 goals in there. And in everything that we're going to be engaging on in terms of reforming the payment system landscape, the regulatory environment, the collaborative space, you'll see those 9 goals touching in one way or another. But then bringing it back to where you actually asking me is that in that whole realm, we should ensure that there's a transparent regulatory framework that ensures that things hold. And in that journey, the regulators should ensure that they come together. They set out a regulatory framework, and I hope that would be enabling for the market to be able to have an interoperable middle mile infrastructure. And on that middle mile infrastructure, the participants and service providers can come on and compete on products and services. Now, this goes back to what you hinted on, Maurits, the opening speech of yesterday, where we view payment systems to a large degree as utility services that everybody deserves. But there's an element or a space where competition should come in, and this should be on product services, on an infrastructure that is accessible to all in order for the public to benefit. Now, if I'm going to take a few jurisdictions, and I'll come back to ours because you directed me directly to our regulatory reforms, and I'll take, for instance, some of our sister regulatory authorities, central banks, and I'll take the Canadian example, which is more closely knit in terms of the regulation and the establishment of the infrastructure, its rollout, where the parties, both from public and private, come together to ensure that that happens. And indeed, we still need to have the parties compete on that infrastructure. That is the one example. I'll take India. Some of you could be aware that recently, to what Maurits indicated, they have nudged the private sector to come together to establish a structure that will foster collaboration and that would ensure establishment of interoperable solutions or infrastructures. India has done that. In the past, somewhere, I think a few years ago, the European community launched what they called the European Payment Initiative. This was an initiative that is backed by the European Central Bank that aimed to take the private sector to foster integration of payments infrastructure in order to establish a pan-European infrastructure. As you know, they were individual countries coming together. How can you foster that to ensure that you have an infrastructure that is robust, where the participants can come on and develop products and offer services and then compete? And in our case, the same. we coming from a period where PASA served us well. We indicated it was recognized way back in the 90s, and it did its job. Unfortunately for us, our regulatory framework was too prescriptive as to what PASA should do and how should it be organized and all that. And that's our law as it stands. And thus we had to review PASA, coming with the recommendations that Maurits you related to. And then we actually looked at reviewing our legislative framework to ensure that we live with the times. When the legal framework was set out, the dominance in the payment system was coming from banks, but things have evolved. Now we have a number of non-banks playing in the space, a number of fintechs, other parties that are coming to add value, and the legal framework is constraining, and thus we thought we should go on a journey, working in this note that I indicated, having the public and private sector to look at ensuring that we establish a payment industry body that is inclusive and that would ensure that we drive our system, a payment system, to be aligned to the future. And in this respect, I mean, I would go back and say maybe at the very core, we need infrastructures that offer interoperability. The transacting public should be able to reach anyone conveniently. And lastly, when you ask that I can look at some of the issues that are of importance, I'm looking at one of the key goals, looking at flexibility and adaptability. Whatever we put together should not be for now. We should be anticipating what could be in the horizon that at least we need to look at and ensure that we factor that to make what we put in place flexible and adaptable to change circumstances. I would stop here, Maurits, but we can engage further.
Thank you, Tim. I think I'm not going to let you off the hook directly. I think the words that you used, that PASA has served the industry well, probably conjures up the question with everybody, why not just extend PASA or expand PASA to be more inclusive? I think the Reserve Bank is saying we should establish something new here. And we would like to know what is the considerations then perhaps from the Reserve Bank's perspective in establishing a new PIB. And, you know, in that then we have to obviously strike the balance between retaining what has served as well, but also build new capabilities. But why the new? Could you perhaps just give us that view?
Yes, Maurits, quite important what you're asking, but I'll start off by saying that we should ensure that we do not lose what works. We need new, but we need to retain what works. And direct to your question, indeed, it would have been very easy to say that PASA has served us well, there's restrictive membership, and perhaps we could just readjust the focus and get it to work going forward. But we thought that perhaps there could be sentiments out there that PASA is a bank body because the bank largely has dominated the payment system coming from the past. And essentially, as we move forward, we should move forward with everybody. My specific issue here is we do not wish to see a situation where this transition is seen as the banks opening up to accept others. But it should be seen as a process where the private sector comes together to shape what needs to be in place for the future. Now, this goes to the question that says, the Reserve Bank has chosen to request that PASA coordinates this effort due to the fact that they are the currently recognized payment system management body, and we believe they have the capability. But that should not be read to say PASA will have self-interest and try and push an agenda here. We need to recognize that we put in something new with PASA coordinating the efforts so that proposals coming from the market can be made to the Reserve Bank jointly with other regulators for our backing in terms of what needs to be put in place going forward. So my emphasis is everybody should feel that they are equal in the establishment so that it's not seen as others opening the door for others to come in. So that's in essence what we're trying to get at. And if parties believe that they could make us lose something, they should voice that in the structures, and they can still even voice it with us. We need what works for everybody. As I said at the outset, Maurits, we need public-private sector commitment for us to put in place what works for SA Inc. and SA Inc. linking into the region, the continent, and the globe.
Thank you very much, Tim. I think I want to move on. We've got a big panel here, and I think they all are so well informed on this topic. So I'm going to go to Ghita next. Ghita, you're the current CEO of PASA. You've been about 10 months in the seat. You're probably in a position where you can still look with fresh eyes, although I think that window is disappearing very fast now. But from looking at this organization with fresh eyes, and to the point that Tim also made about having served the industry quite well, what do you believe are some of those competencies that you've seen now that must be retained at all costs because it's really important for the industry? But at the same time, you know, what are some of the areas where you see there's room for improvement, where we can actually do a different job or a better job?
Thanks, Maurits, and thank you, Tim, for that introduction. So I'm going to pull quite a lot on what Tim and Herman, in fact, previously said, and the model that Herman spoke about collaboration, which is where all parties share a common goal. And that came through very strongly in the feedback from Tim as well around a commitment between the private and the public sector. And one of the things that I've walked into and value tremendously is the incredible working relationship that we do have with the Reserve Bank and with other regulators as well. The ability for us to engage as an industry in the way that we do on a trusted basis in a conversation about what is good for the industry is incredibly powerful. And when we talk to sister payments industry bodies or associations, we don't always hear the same message. We hear a lot about the regulator this, the regulator that. We don't have that here, and I think it's absolutely critical that going forward, whatever's in place, that relationship is retained and maintained. I think one of the other very powerful things within the PASA environment, which we tend to underestimate a bit because we take it for granted, but again, when you talk to a wider community, is our ability to pull in true expertise from across the industry and not only to have to rely on our own resource. So we have a very strong and long history of pulling in the specific experts on clearing interoperability and say card if that's the piece of work that's being done. And while I agree we need to bring far more parties into that conversation, I'd also like to believe we've started on that journey, at least in a project environment where we have a couple of projects that we are bringing in a broader community of parties for their input and their expertise. There are obviously a bunch of functions that we're doing at the moment, to the point that's been repeatedly made this morning around the job that's been done by PASA historically that cannot stop. And those include all the efforts around managing the payment systems from a safety, security, risk perspective, as well as the various modernization initiatives that we're doing in conjunction with the industry. So rapid payments program, the debit check work, SARB modernization where we're assisting the Reserve Bank. But critically, many of our risk initiatives, so the debit order abuse work that we've done, where we talk about something like 9 billion rands worth of rogue debit orders prevented from hitting the system over a period of a couple of years. You know, that work is critical, and we have a very small group of experts at the centre who draw on the broader community in order to do this piece of work. So I think that we retain that expertise and the ability to engage with the regulators and the industry is an absolute necessity going forward in whatever we do. In terms of the things that that need to change, obviously the inclusiveness needs to change, and we're on that journey. It's going to be interesting because in the conversations we've had, we start talking about balance. So the balance of inclusiveness versus speed, or expertise versus inclusiveness. And I think that the job that is on all of us who are part of structuring and designing this new payment industry body is to make sure that we get the balance correct. The balance of protecting what works today and manages the risk in the system versus the balance against the reforms that are very clearly needed. So big responsibility for all of us. And then the last thing that I would like to almost throw out there as a challenge, because I don't know the answer to this one, is how do we do things quicker? You know, the world is changing so fast. And I accept that the payments interoperable middle mile, you know, when you put in place a new system, it costs billions. It involves multiple parties across a number of areas. Many people have to do system development in their own worlds, as well as what has to be done at the center. But how do we get those decisions made quicker? How do we get that work done quicker? I don't think that we're in a world anymore where we can take 5-10 years to roll out a new payment system. And that's just a thought I would like to leave you with. I don't have the answer to it.
Thank you, Ghita. You're talking about balance. Perhaps let me just quickly expand on that and link it also back to what Tim has asked. Tim has asked PASA to actually coordinate the process or facilitate the process. Now, how would you do that in a balanced way, in a way in which we are not seen to influence the process, but really to facilitate and to support? Can you tell us a little bit about the thinking, the structures, the process designed now to actually make this an inclusive, balanced process that can be trusted by all?
So from day one, we've been aware that it is an interesting balance that we sit with, and the word balance keeps coming out in this conversation, between being the industry experts with 25 years of experience in actually doing this work, and then needing to facilitate an inclusive, credible, and transparent process. And we've done a couple of things to try and assist us with that. We've brought on external support, both from a logistics and from a make sure that we are running independently perspective. But most important probably is the structures we've put in place in the project, which have received huge support, I'm delighted to say, from the broader community. So the first is the concept of the industry forum or the plenary, which is where we get together everybody that we think may have an interest in this conversation, or who even has indicated they have an interest in this conversation. And please, guys, if there's somebody out there that we've missed, make contact with us and we will add you into that process, because the last thing any of us want to do is get to the end of this big piece of design work and someone says, but I wasn't consulted. And that plenary is there for consultation. It's to go, as Tim says, and ask for input from the industry, for ideas from the community, and to consult on the various options that are on the table. We have also put in place a design team, which is made up of credible experts, a number of whom sit on this panel, from around the industry. And their responsibility is to make sure that the process is fair, transparent, and credible, and that the content that we take to the plenary or to the industry forum for broader discussion is well considered, is balanced, and gives realistic and meaningful options without pushing any given bias. So that the constitution of that design team and their role is very critical. And I must say it really has been a pleasure working with them so far. And then there's the final piece, which is a sign-off process that happens outside of the forums. And that is when we ask the various segments in the onion ring to say whether they have sufficient consensus to support what's on the table or not. And this was a concept that Herman touched on in his presentation yesterday as well, when he spoke, funny enough, about the Cadesa history and how do you get a community, a social problem, or a social benefit to work together. And the principle there was of sufficient consensus. The other phrase I love in this respect is one that came from my counterpart from the Australian organization, who used the phrase progress ahead of perfection. And to Tim's point, whatever we build and whatever we co-design must be done in such a way that it is a learning organization. So the process we're running to facilitate building the payments industry body is a learning process. It's adaptive. We change as we get feedback from the plenary and from the design team. And the organization that ultimately gets designed must have that ability as well, to be reflective, to learn, and to change in our very rapidly changing world.
Thank you very much, Ghita. I'm going to move on. Rufida, you are representing one of the major banks, Entersekt. You are part of payments for many, many years. You are currently the group payments head of Entersekt. Now, PASA has served the banking community probably very well for many, many years. And now suddenly we are opening up. And, I think we are all curious to see this from a bank perspective and to understand what it is that you are seeing. So I'm just thinking about all the billions of rands that has been invested in payments by the banking community. Now suddenly we're opening it up, and other players are also invited to come in. I'm curious to understand how success would look from a bank perspective in this new PIB. In such that it would still continue to serve the bank's interest, but now also serve a broader community. Can you define how success would look in this new PIB from your perspective?
Thanks, Maurits. I think the first thing is I want to acknowledge Tim's points around he doesn't want to be involved in the formulation of a body where there's a sense that banks have been dragged to the watering well. And I think that certainly is not my view, or I would like to say the view more broadly held amongst bankers in the room. I think the reality, though, is that for a multitude of years, decades, banks have held influence in this environment. And you speak about infrastructural investment, historical legacy investment. It's there. To go, down that path and to unpack bank investment and the reasons that it was made is probably going to lead us away from the challenge at hand, which is how we're moving forward. So when I think about this body, the new body, and how careful I want to be that it is not a PASA version 2.0, because we certainly don't want that. We want a body that will serve an inclusive participant base, and that I think I support as someone who's been in banking for all of my career, and I think that's more broadly held from payment participants who are banks. The invitation to non-bank participants and being part of the PIB process, sitting on the design team as well, has refreshed my enthusiasm for this process and for what we are moving towards, more specifically because I feel the energy, I feel the robustness in terms of drive amongst non-bank participants, call them that, or non-traditional players in the space. So I think that we are ready, we're primed for the environment to open up more broadly. I think that if we want to talk about what are the critical success markers, and how we know we got it right at the end of this, I can't tell you that entirely today, Maurits. I feel like it's early days. I feel like there are a few things we need to consider. One critical success factor for me would be that we're not just tinkering with PASA as it is and kicking out a model that says, oh, well, we've got more participants now, so this should work. We want real reform. But I would envisage an environment where we have a new PIB that allows banks to, all participants coming into the space and allows banks the comfort of knowing that there has been almost forensic, management, that tightly critical management of risks in this environment. So we talk about collaboration, great. I think we're all at that, at that juncture. We talk about opening up, and I think that's a given. But what we haven't really spoken a lot about is an environment that for decades has been carefully curated to manage risk, to manage the consumer experience. The bank account has been, the store of value for customers. When you think about serving South Africa, it's been one of the gateways into broader payment services, and that currently sits with the banks. So one of the necessary milestones that we have to overcome or get to is the legislative framework adjustments that need to allow for non-bank participants to come into the space where a bank is not throwing their weight behind them, and everybody understands and carries a true share of that regulatory and risk burden. I think that's a real success factor I don't believe that the non-traditional players in payment spaces are not understanding that, but I think the reality is the expertise and carefully being the custodian of the space has sat with the banks. So that requires adjustment. That it can happen, I have no doubt. That it can happen in time is probably the measure of success, and when we say, okay, we've arrived. And the last thing is, we have to talk about infrastructural investment going forward, because we are bringing in so many participants who are have yet to invest and will probably bring in volume that is competitive with bank volumes. We want to make sure that everybody carries that taxation burden. And I think that would be the fair outcome for me as a bank sitting in this room, as well as for other bank players in this space.
Thanks, Rufida. I'm conscious that we've got about 5 minutes left, and we've got still so much to explore, and the rich perspectives that Gerhard and Hennie can offer. So I'm going to go to the two of you. And Gerhard, let me start with you. Probably a similar question from a fintech community, because that's what you represent. How would success look from your perspective? What would be a marker of success or markers of success in this new thing that we are creating here, in that it would serve the fintech community?
Yeah, thanks, Maurits. It's an interesting dichotomy, because we've not been involved, for 25 years directly. We've always sat on the sides and thrown stones in, and now we can participate. So I think that's exciting. I perhaps want to first say that the fintech industry in itself is very nebulous, and we shouldn't think that it's this simple group. And I don't necessarily even represent all of those groups. I mean, there are people that compete with banks and people that work with banks. There are people that have a consumer brand and others that works in the background. There are people that build tech and people that use and operate tech. It's very diverse. I think I mentioned to you guys before, even Stripe is seen as a fintech, and they're a $95 billion company. They're bigger than banks. So it's diverse. For me, the hope is quite simple, is that we can enable an innovation to flourish with efficient market forces that range, that we are able to get efficiency in the system and able to serve our consumers. It's an incredibly dynamic time in payments with open banking and faster payments. The whole world is changing. The whole world is opening up. So breaking down those barriers to entry is important. I think that the next one for me is that we can clearly define the guardrails. Even open banking in Europe, when it was started, it said open up, but protect the consumer in this way and that way. And that means that there's a clear place to play and a clear place where you cannot go beyond, and where you can therefore play within those boundaries. The amount of times innovation in South Africa has said, well, I don't know, that sounds like sorted source, let's not do it. We need clear guardrails and clear opportunities, and perhaps I'll throw it in alignment to industry norms. So we're excited to participate. I think we also feel a burden of responsibility to get it right, because the Reserve Bank has not forced it down. They've allowed us to participate. So there's responsibility to get it right. So thanks, Tim. We're going to do our best job, but it's a big group to corral. And then I think the last one, and I say this with sensitivity, is concerned perhaps about just being tokens in this process, being just sort of also dragged along, because we're not necessarily as versed in the, I'm going to use the word bureaucracy, or in the processes and navigating all of those processes, and potentially uncertain about that. But really excited about getting that balance right between innovation and consumer protection, being earlier involved and being able to play without needing to be this big player. I'll stop there, but I think that ability for us to participate earlier, being able to innovate with clear guardrails, protecting the consumer, but still being able to play, is really exciting. And excited to be on this journey.
Thank you, Gerhard, and I'm glad to hear that you guys are excited to be part of this. But I'm also hearing the fear, and Hennie, I hope you also heard it, that Gerhard says, they hope not to be tokens in this process. And I think everybody enters this now with concerns about how will we balance the rights and obligations between old participants, strong participants like the banks, and players that are in different places in the payments value chain. Now, you've been in your capacity as chair of PSSF, you've probably onboarded many lessons already on this journey in terms of what work and what we should consider and not. But I think specifically I want to ask you, what is it that we should take into account to make sure that through this whole process there's a proper balance? And Ghita also referred to the balance. It sounds to me balance is the main thing to achieve here. How would we balance the rights between the old, the new, the strong, the weaker, and so on?
So Maurits, coming at the end, first of all, echoing all of the sentiments that's expressed here, and hoping not to repeat. So in answering the question, I'm going to draw from my microfinance South Africa experience, which is also 25 years old, and the PSSF experience, which we signed off this morning on agenda 122 since inception. And we've learned a lot. And the first point I want to make in this audience being probably 50% banking, the non-banks need to know that not only are the banks well organized, they are experienced in being well organized. And that is a feather in their cap. And we cannot afford to lose that wisdom and IP that is built into the system. Gerhard's point about the diversity of the non-bank world, we need to acknowledge that up front. I could speak for 5 hours on that. In the PSSF, 4,500 users, associations as big as a CISA, bigger than some banks, and then a little startup with 10 members. And to bring all of that into one space, I'm going right back to and trained in sociology to Herman's talk of yesterday. This is about people, it's about the sociology, it's about the social psychology, and it's about modern anthropology. And we need to understand that. It's critical that we understand that. Now, in that space, collaboration is key, but like Ferreira said, to me, it moves to trust. If you move in a space where we are now, it's very easy to be cynical, and there will be cynics out there. And it's also very easy to be fearful of failure. So it's critical that you show courage in this situation. Now, having said that, you need to contribute. The bane of non-banks, I'm saying to you, are free riders. Across the world, I've seen it. I've been privileged to travel with some of you and on my own and with other institutions. Those who free ride, they lose their right to criticize in my book. If you're not at the table, you will be on the menu. You will be on the menu. And that to me says that your contribution comes with an obligation. And tied into that, this is going to be controversial. The fact that you are first mover on some invention or some innovation doesn't give you the right to dominate that. Because if we take that logic, the banks will never move, to Rufaida's point. The guys have made investment and they have done the work. And there is a lot of good which we need to acknowledge, but we are faced with a new anthropology that's being born as we speak. So that is an important element, and I already picked it up. People say, well, I've got this great idea, therefore the world must be built around my idea. It is the principle of interoperability and the continuous evolution impacts on banks and non-banks equally, and we all have to play. To me, there is 3 final points I would like to make. One is business needs to be protected in this space. Having said that, competition is, and Tim made reference to it. My second point is the regulator must be in the room. Our formation of the PSSF in early days, Tim's colleagues was in every meeting. They never said a word. They never voted. They reprimanded me a couple of times on certain matters offline, which was useful. And they guided us and they helped us in our interaction with banks. And let me just say, my first meeting in the MFSA was a meeting with the Banking Council of the time. We were called the MLA, got in our car and we met because we had to talk about the dilemma in payments because people were retaining card and PIN. And we rid the system of that officially. And then my final word, Maurits, to all of us, that includes the banks, what we want to achieve here is damn hard work. It is unbelievably hard work. I turned 45 last week, as you know, and look what it's done to me. Maurits turned 35, and look what it's done to him. This is real hard work. And you're navigating through a space where there is no recipe. They're not going to teach you this stuff at Harvard. And you can go to Singapore and China and Botswana, wherever you wish to go, as often as you like. That is important. Ultimately, you need to craft your own future on a basis of collaboration and trust within the context what is international. That is hard. That would be my contribution, Maurits. Thank you.
Thank you, Hennie. Very insightful. And we basically have a minute left, and I'm just going to ask Tim. Tim, you probably hear the excitement that we all have about this, the support of this. Any closing thoughts from your side?
Yes, Maurits, indeed, I think this is exciting, and I want to echo that indeed we don't underestimate this. It's hard work, but we have to get it right, and we can only get it right if everybody puts their ideas on the table. Now, Maurits, I think in terms of looking at the payment system, we recognize that the private sector should support the regulators in terms of achievement of public policy objectives. And that's why in Vision 2025, we have one of the goals talking to public accountability. And we're saying the providers of payment services have got accountability to the public. And in this instance, they should indeed craft their business models to make money for the shareholder, but also discharge on the public accountability that is expected of them, and linking it to the opening address of yesterday. That would be my closing thoughts. Thanks, Maurits.
Thank you, Tim. And with that burden of accountability, I think we all going forward in this process, looking forward to this. Thank you for your support, Tim, and thank you to all my panelists, Ghita, Ferreira, Gerhard, and Hennie. Thank you for everything.